The sun blazed mercilessly over a remote stretch of road in Kentucky. Inside a gleaming silver Mercedes, Matthew Evans, a retired millionaire in his late 70s, sat behind the wheel, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioner's feeble hum. His face betrayed a mix of irritation and disbelief as he stared at the flat tire that had rudely interrupted his otherwise uneventful day. Used to life bending to his whims, the former finance mogul found himself in an unfamiliar position. Helpless, stranded far from the luxuries of his pristine estate. "Of all days," Matthew muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He had already tried calling for roadside assistance, but his phone had no signal. The realization dawned on him. He would have to wait. His frustration deepened with every passing minute. Just as Matthew began to feel the weight of his isolation, a figure emerged in the shimmering heatwave. A boy, no older than 14, approached with steady strides. Dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn sneakers, his determined expression contrasted starkly with his modest appearance. As he neared, Matthew noticed the boy's eyes, sharp, observant, and far older than his years. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice calm but curious. Matthew hesitated, caught off guard. Yes, I do," he stammered, gesturing toward the deflated tire. "I was hoping for help, but there's no signal out here." The boy nodded, his demeanor confident yet unassuming. "I can fix that for you. Do you have a spare?" Matthew gestured to the trunk, and the boy got to work without hesitation. As the young stranger knelt by the car, pulling out tools and setting the spare tire into place, Matthew observed him with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Despite his modest clothes and dusty hands, the boy carried himself with a kind of dignity Matthew hadn't encountered in years. "Who taught you to do this?" Matthew asked after a moment of silence. "My grandpa," the boy replied, not looking up. "Said it's always good to know how to help yourself and others." Matthew's brow furrowed. The boy's words lingered in the air, striking a chord he didn't expect. For years, Matthew had surrounded himself with people driven by transactions and deals. Yet here was someone offering help freely, without any expectation in return. When the boy finished, he stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. "All done, sir," he said, flashing a small, satisfied smile. Matthew reached for his wallet, pulling out a few crisp bills. "Here," he offered. "Take this. You've earned it." The boy shook his head, stepping back. "No, thank you. Just happy to help." Before Matthew could respond, the boy turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller as he disappeared down the road. Stunned, Matthew slipped the money back into his pocket. For the rest of his drive, the image of the boy, his quiet confidence, his refusal of a reward, stayed with him, stirring something long buried within. That night, as Matthew sat alone in his lavish study, sipping scotch and staring at his untouched dinner, the boy's words replayed in his mind. "It's always good to know how to help yourself, and others." The simplicity of it gnawed at him, pulling him into a spiral of reflection. The next morning, Matthew couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the interaction with the boy had left unfinished business. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. The boy's selflessness had unearthed a sense of humility Matthew hadn't felt in decades. He decided almost impulsively to find him. Driving along the same stretch of road, Matthew scanned the horizon, his mind teeming with questions. Who was the boy? Where did he live? What kind of upbringing shaped someone so grounded? Hours passed as he stopped at diners and gas stations, describing the boy to anyone who would listen. "Sounds like you're talking about Elijah," said an older woman at a small cafe, wiping her hands on an apron. "He's always helping folks around here. Lives with his mama over in Harlan." "Harlan?" Matthew repeated, noting the name. "How far is that?" "About an hour east," she replied. "You can't miss it. Quiet town, good people." The drive to Harlan was scenic, with rolling hills and lush green landscapes, but Matthew barely noticed. His mind was fixed on Elijah. As he entered the small town, its modest charm struck him, a stark contrast to the grandeur he was accustomed to. He stopped a few locals, asking for Elijah, and was eventually directed to a small house on the edge of town. The house was humble, its weathered exterior telling a story of resilience. The front porch sagged slightly, and a handmade wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. Matthew hesitated for a moment before knocking. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s, her tired but kind eyes studying him curiously. "Can I help you?" she asked. Matthew cleared his throat. "Good morning. I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. Elijah, right? He helped me with a flat tire." The woman's expression softened, a proud smile tugging at her lips. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said. "He's always helping folks. You're welcome to come in." The interior of the house was modest but warm. Family photos adorned the walls, and the furniture, though old, was meticulously kept. Matthew noted the contrast between this cozy home and his own sterile mansion. He was led out to the backyard, where Elijah was repairing a broken fence. The boy looked up, surprised to see Matthew. "Hey, mister," Elijah said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled, feeling a twinge of nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "You helped me when I really needed it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, his expression genuine. "It wasn't a big deal." "It was to me," Matthew replied firmly. "People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return." Elijah tilted his head, as though puzzled by the idea. "I don't see it like that. If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I?" The boy's words struck Matthew like a hammer. He glanced at the patched fence, the uneven grass, and the rusted swing set in the yard. Despite their modest surroundings, Elijah and his family exuded a warmth and integrity that felt almost foreign to him. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Matthew said. "Your mother must be proud." Elijah grinned, glancing back toward the house. "She works hard. I just try to help out where I can." Matthew fell silent, the boy's easy demeanor putting him at a rare loss for words. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of nostalgia. Memories of his own humble beginnings resurfaced, mingled with a sense of regret for the values he had long abandoned. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," Matthew said finally. Elijah straightened, his expression cautious. "We're okay, mister. We don't need anything." "It's not about need," Matthew insisted. "It's about what's right. You helped me, and I'd like to return the favor." Before Elijah could respond, his mother called from the porch. "Elijah! You better come inside and wash up before lunch." As Elijah headed inside, his mother turned to Matthew. "You're welcome to join us," she said. "It's nothing fancy, but you're more than welcome." Matthew hesitated but found himself saying, "I'd like that." He followed her into the house, feeling strangely out of place in his tailored suit amidst their modest but vibrant home. For the first time in years, Matthew Evans felt more like a man and less like a millionaire. The small kitchen was alive with the rich aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables. Matthew sat at the modest wooden table, its surface worn smooth from years of use. Surrounding him were mismatched chairs, their imperfections speaking of a family that prioritized function over luxury. Elijah washed his hands at the sink before joining his mother, who was plating their simple but hearty meal. "Thank you for inviting me," Matthew said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. The warmth of their home contrasted starkly with the cold precision of his own mansion, and he felt an odd mix of comfort and unease. "You're welcome here any time," Elijah's mother replied, setting down a dish of steaming vegetables. "We don't have much, but we make do." As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally, carried by Elijah's boyish enthusiasm. He spoke about school, his friends, and his dreams of becoming an engineer. Matthew found himself captivated by the boy's curiosity and unyielding optimism, traits that reminded him of his younger self before life's ambitions clouded his vision. "What kind of engineer?" Matthew asked, genuinely curious. "Structural," Elijah said confidently. "I like to build things, make them strong, make "That's a good ambition," Matthew replied. "It takes a sharp mind and a steady hand." Elijah shrugged. "It's what I like, and I want to make things better, for people." Matthew glanced at Elijah's mother, who watched her son with quiet pride. She had raised a boy who, despite their humble circumstances, dreamed of improving the world. The meal continued with light-hearted banter, but Matthew's mind was already racing. He had come here to thank Elijah, but now he felt compelled to do more. As they cleared the table, Matthew turned to Elijah's mother. "You've done a remarkable job raising him. He's got more heart than most people I know." Her eyes shone with gratitude, though her voice carried the weight of years of struggle. "Thank you. It hasn't been easy, but we've always focused on what matters." Later that afternoon, Matthew stood in the backyard with Elijah. The boy was mending the fence again, his hands steady as he worked with mismatched planks of wood. Matthew watched in silence for a moment, taking in the scene: the sagging porch, the rusted swing set, the uneven grass. The house and yard spoke of resilience, of a family that had weathered storms with dignity and grace. "You really take pride in this, don't you?" Matthew asked. Elijah paused, looking up with a small smile. "It's our home. Might not look like much, but it's ours." Matthew nodded, a flicker of nostalgia crossing his face. "I grew up in a place like this," he admitted, surprising even himself. "Small house. My parents worked hard to keep it together. They taught me the value of effort, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that." Elijah tilted his head, his curiosity evident. "What do you mean?" Matthew hesitated, then sighed. "I got caught up in chasing money, status, things that don't fill the emptiness inside. Seeing you and your mom, it reminds me of what I've forgotten." Elijah didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned back to the fence, hammering a nail into place. "I think it's good you remember," he said simply. "People change, but they can change back too." Matthew felt the boy's words settle deep within him. Here was a child, wise beyond his years, reminding a man who had everything of the true essence of life. Before leaving that day, Matthew made a promise to himself. This wasn't just about gratitude. It was about doing something meaningful, something that could honor the values Elijah and his mother lived by. The next morning, Matthew set his plan in motion. He began making calls, dozens of them, to contractors, suppliers, and old business associates. Though retired, he still wielded influence, and he wasn't afraid to use it for something that truly mattered. Within a week, the first trucks arrived at Elijah's home. The sound of engines and workers unloading supplies filled the air as Matthew stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. Elijah and his mother stepped onto the porch, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What is all this?" Elijah's mother asked, her voice trembling. Matthew smiled, his tone steady but sincere. "This is what's right. You gave me something I didn't know I needed, a reminder of what's important. Let me give back." "But we've managed fine on our own," she protested, her hands gripping the edge of her apron. "I know you have," Matthew said gently. "This isn't about charity. It's about showing up for people who deserve it." Elijah stood silently, his eyes darting between the workers and Matthew. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to do this." "I know," Matthew replied, "but I want to. You helped me when I needed it, without expecting anything. Let me do the same." For a moment no one spoke. Then Elijah's mother nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing us." The renovations began in earnest. The sagging porch was replaced with sturdy new wood, the rusty swing set out back was swapped for a safe and colorful one, and the roof was repaired to withstand any storm. Inside, the walls were painted, the floors polished, and the kitchen upgraded with modern appliances. At first, Elijah tried to help, carrying planks and sweeping debris, but Matthew gently pulled him aside one afternoon. "Your job," Matthew said with a smile, "is to enjoy being a kid for a little while." Elijah grinned but couldn't resist sneaking outside to watch the workers. His curiosity was infectious, and soon one of the contractors, a burly man named Joe, invited him to help measure wood planks. Elijah's eyes lit up as he learned the basics of construction, peppering the workers with questions about tools and techniques. Matthew watched from a distance, a warmth spreading through him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful, not for recognition or profit, but simply because it was right. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Matthew stood with Elijah and his mother, surveying the nearly finished house. The transformation was astonishing. The house that once seemed tired and worn now radiated life and hope. The yard, once sparse and uneven, was now a haven of warmth and joy. Elijah's mother turned to Matthew, her voice trembling with gratitude. "This isn't just a house anymore. It's a home. I don't know how we can ever thank you." Matthew shook his head, his voice soft. "You already have. You reminded me of what life is supposed to be about: family, connection, and purpose." Elijah looked up at Matthew, his expression thoughtful. "You know, mister, I've been thinking. I want to do something like this one day. I want to help people too." Matthew placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his tone steady. "You already have, Elijah. Your kindness set all of this in motion. Don't ever lose that." As the stars began to dot the sky, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of fulfillment that came not from wealth or success, but from connection and gratitude. This wasn't the end, he realized. It was the beginning of something much greater. The days that followed were bustling with activity. Matthew returned to Elijah's home almost daily, his tailored suits replaced by more casual attire, a stark departure from the polished image he once upheld. Workers hammered and sawed, their voices blending with the sounds of drills and the occasional laughter from Elijah, who couldn't resist being part of the action. Elijah's curiosity grew with each passing day. One afternoon he stood beside Joe, the burly contractor who had taken a liking to him. "Why do you cut the wood at an angle like that?" Elijah asked, his eyes following Joe's hands intently. "It's called a miter cut," Joe explained, holding up the saw. "Gives a stronger joint. You're a quick learner, kid." Matthew watched from the porch, a smile tugging at his lips. Seeing Elijah's enthusiasm reminded him of his own childhood, back when he would tinker with his father's tools. For years, he had buried those memories beneath layers of ambition and wealth, but now they surfaced with surprising clarity. That evening, as the crew packed up for the day, Elijah approached Matthew, a streak of sawdust across his cheek. "This is the most fun I've had in ages," he said, his grin infectious. "Then keep at it," Matthew encouraged. "You've got a knack for this." The transformation of the house wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Neighbors began stopping by, drawn by the sight of trucks and scaffolding. One brought a loaf of freshly baked bread, another offered jars of homemade jam. Soon the yard was alive with people, their presence a testament to the close-knit community Elijah's family was a part of. "You've brought the whole town together," Elijah's mother said to Matthew one afternoon as they watched the workers and neighbors mingle. "It's more than we ever expected." Matthew shook his head, his gaze lingering on Elijah, who was deep in conversation with Joe about power tools. "Your son is the one who brought us all together," he replied. "I'm just following his lead." The day of completion arrived faster than anyone expected. The once sagging porch now stood sturdy and polished, the roof gleamed in the sunlight, and the backyard, once uneven and sparse, was now a lively space complete with a new swing set and freshly planted grass. Inside, the home felt transformed, walls painted in warm tones, the kitchen modernized yet retaining its cozy charm. Elijah's mother stood on the porch, her hand over her mouth as she surveyed the changes. "It doesn't look like our house," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It feels like a dream." "It's not a dream, Mom," Elijah said, his voice trembling with awe. "It's real." Matthew stood nearby, his heart swelling with pride. This moment, seeing their joy, was more fulfilling than any business deal he had ever closed. "I hope it feels like home," he said, "because that's what it's meant to be, As the day turned into evening, the yard filled with friends, neighbors, and workers who had become like family over the course of the project. Elijah raced around, showing his friends the new swing set and the freshly painted rooms, his laughter ringing through the air. "Matthew, you've done more than fix a house," Elijah's mother said, joining him near the porch. "You've given us hope. I don't know how to thank you." Matthew shook his head, his voice soft. "You've already thanked me, more than you realize. Your family reminded me of what matters most, something I lost a long time ago." At that moment, Elijah ran up, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Matthew, guess what Joe taught me today? How to use a level. I think I'm really getting the hang of this." Matthew smiled, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't ever stop learning." Elijah nodded earnestly, his eyes shining with determination. "I won't. And one day, I'll help people the way you've helped us." "You already do, Elijah," Matthew said. "You've taught me more than I could ever teach you. Never lose that kindness. It's what makes you who you are." As the sun set, the gathering quieted, and Matthew found himself sitting on the newly rebuilt porch beside Elijah and his mother. The sky burned with hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the house. "This isn't the end," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "This is just the beginning. You have so much potential, Elijah, and I'll be here to support you every step of the way." Elijah's mother reached out, squeezing Matthew's hand. "You're part of our family now," she said, her voice steady with gratitude. Matthew nodded, his eyes misting over. For the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of belonging, not because of his wealth or accomplishments, but because of the connections he had built. This small house, this resilient family, had given him something priceless, a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, Elijah's home became the talk of the small town. The renovations weren't just a transformation of a house, they were a testament to the power of generosity and community. But for Matthew, the changes went beyond the physical. He felt a deep connection with Elijah and his family, as if their lives had become intertwined in ways he hadn't anticipated. One morning, Matthew arrived to check on the finishing touches. Elijah greeted him at the gate, his face lit with excitement. "Mr. Matthew, look," he said, holding up a small wooden birdhouse he'd built from leftover scraps. "That's impressive," Matthew said, examining the intricate details. "You've got talent, Elijah. You should keep building." Elijah's eyes sparkled. "Joe said the same thing. He's teaching me more about tools and measurements." Matthew smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Good. And when you're ready, I'll help you get the training you need to become an engineer." "You mean it?" Elijah asked, his voice filled with awe. "I do," Matthew replied firmly. "You've got the drive and the heart. The world needs people like you." Inside the house, Elijah's mother was preparing lunch, her movements brisk but purposeful. When Matthew stepped into the kitchen, she looked up with a warm smile. "You've done so much for us already," she said. "You've changed our lives." "You've changed mine too," Matthew replied. "This isn't just about what I've given. It's about what I've learned. Your son reminded me of values I lost sight of a long time ago." She nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "It's rare to find someone who cares so deeply. I hope you know how much this means to us." As they sat down for lunch, Elijah eagerly shared his latest ideas, plans to build a treehouse in the backyard, dreams of designing bridges one day. Matthew listened intently, his mind already racing with ways to help the boy achieve his goals. The day the renovations were officially completed felt like a celebration. The house was no longer just a structure, it was a sanctuary, brimming with life and hope. Neighbors gathered to see the changes, their admiration evident as they congratulated Elijah's family. "You've done something incredible here," Joe said to Matthew as they stood by the newly painted fence. "You've given this family more than just a house. You've given them a future." "That's what they gave me," Matthew replied. "They reminded me of what really matters." As the festivities continued, Elijah's laughter echoed through the yard. He swung high on the new set Matthew had installed, his friends cheering him on. For a moment, Matthew allowed himself to simply observe, taking in the joy he had helped create. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Elijah approached Matthew with a notebook in hand. "I've been drawing some designs," he said shyly, opening the pages to reveal sketches of bridges and buildings. "These are fantastic," Matthew said, his voice tinged with genuine admiration. "You've got a gift, Elijah. Don't ever let go of it." "I won't," Elijah promised. "And one day I'll use it to help people, just like you did for us." Matthew placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You already are. And when the time comes, I'll be here to help you take that next step." The weeks that followed brought even more changes. Matthew arranged for Elijah to shadow local builders and engineers, giving him hands-on experience. The boy soaked up knowledge like a sponge, his enthusiasm infectious to everyone around him. For Matthew, these visits became a regular part of his life. Each trip to the small town felt less like an obligation and more like a homecoming. The once distant businessman now found himself embraced as part of the community, his wealth and status secondary to the genuine relationships he had built. One afternoon, as Matthew prepared to leave, Elijah ran up to him with a broad grin. "Mr. Matthew, I've decided something." "What's that?" Matthew asked, his curiosity piqued. "I want to help people," Elijah said firmly. "Not just my family, but everyone I can, like you taught me." Matthew smiled, his heart full. "Then you'll do great things, Elijah. I have no doubt about that." As the sun set over the town, Matthew drove away, his heart lighter than it had been in decades. The journey that had begun with a flat tire on a desolate road had led him to something far greater, a purpose, a connection, and a reminder of what truly mattered. For Elijah, the future stretched wide with possibilities, and for Matthew, the path ahead felt clearer than ever before. This wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a legacy built on kindness, hope, and the simple, enduring power of showing up for others. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of kindness and connection, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By joining us, you'll help spread more inspiring stories like Elijah and Matthew's, stories that prove a single act of generosity can change lives. Let's keep the spirit of giving alive together. Hit that subscribe button and be a part of something meaningful.